weekly podcast where we try to take today's politics and put them in a larger historical and theoretical context. And today I want to talk about feminism. And I want to ask what might be a provocative question: is feminism in crisis? And I kind of think that it is. I think and there are a couple of data points that kind of lead me to that conclusion. 8 years ago, when Donald Trump was first elected to the White House, his election was met by an almost spontaneous outpouring of outrage. The Women's March kind of materializes almost out of nowhere. Right? It goes from a post on Facebook. This woman says, me and my friends, we should get together and go to Washington, D.C. and have a protest, and it catches fire. And within, I believe, a month or two, tens of millions of people are tens of millions of people are in the streets protesting across the nation. Around the same time, Me Too is tearing its way through through corridors of power, basically through elite political, cultural, economic sectors of our country and other countries. And blowing the lid off of what were open secrets in terms of the persistent, pervasive sexual assault, sexual abuse, rape of women in these positions, kind of embodied by Harvey Weinstein, who was just a serial rapist who raped dozens of women using the power given to him, as a powerful producer. And that's happening all over the place. Today, Donald Trump's been reelected, and there's been no comparable outpouring of outrage. Today, Andrew Cuomo, one of the high-profile targets of Me Too, someone who was pushed out of office because he was a serial sexual abuser, is back. He's running for the mayor of New York City, and it looks like he's likely to win it. So it seems like feminism has receded in energy and vitality over the last decade, give or take. And so I kind of wanted to ask why and what's going on and what is the state of feminism today. And I thought I should have Talia Bhatt on the podcast to talk about it. Talia is a radical feminist who I think has a really interesting perspective on where feminism is today and where it's coming from and where it's going. So yeah, Talia, thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here, and thank you for having me. I certainly have a lot of thoughts about literally everything you've talked about, and the whole is feminism in crisis thing. Yeah.
Yeah, that's my first question for you. Do you agree? Is feminism in crisis?
I mean, I wouldn't have written about well, actually, I don't think my book would have happened at all if feminism wasn't in crisis, to be totally honest. I have some theories as to why that not everyone might necessarily agree with. I'm sure you can point to a lot of different things. One of the things that sort of stood out to me is that while you were going through this sort of electoral history of the past 10 years, when Donald Trump was elected in 2016, there was this almost instant sort of grassroots response, or at the very least, there was like a certain scale of pushback that was both instantaneous and widespread, and we're not really seeing that kind of scale anymore. And a couple of things stand out to me as to what might explain that. One big difference between 2016 and 2024 to start with is that very clearly 2016 was before 2020 and 2024 is after 2020. We're talking about COVID, we're talking about lockdowns, we're talking about the civil rights uprisings that happened around the same time as well, over these issues of racial justice and carcerality in the U.S. legal system coming to the fore. And there was also commensurately, it must be noted, in response to these sort of paradigm shifting events, there was also a lot of institutional backlash and a lot of responses to protests and increasing militarization. by the state and its enforcement arms that have made the landscape, you know if not like that much harsher or different. I mean, there's something of an effect, whether it's like actual material or psychological. People saw how institutions would respond to protests, and maybe that explains a little bit about why there's a lot less verve, as well as the fact that there are like so many more crises these days. But on a more basic level, to sort of like wrap up this entire thread, I think one of the most damning reasons that like you're not seeing as much of a widespread feminist backlash to Trump in 2024 as you are in 2016 is because his rhetorical targets are more emphatically trans people now, quite frankly.
Yeah, that brings together a lot of threads. That you're right that there's been an institutional backlash to a lot of these social movements, and that
Mhm.
backlash was both very physical in a lot of ways, but we've also seen a very strong cultural and intellectual backlash. People who
Mhm.
are pushing back on the styles and methods of feminism and racial justice and social justice generally, in
Mhm.
ways that have been, I mean, like it or not, has been effective, right, at convincing
Mhm.
powerful people that this isn't the way to go. Um, and part of that has been adapting their rhetoric to more aggressively target trans people and other kinds of gender minorities. I do think that I don't want to understate the degree to which Trump is still very much just like a classically misogynist president. And,
Mhm.
factions in his administration are very explicit about the target is, for many of them, it's cis women, right? They want cis women out of
Mhm.
the workforce and back in the home and pregnant and making white babies. So I don't want to
Mhm.
undersell that
Yeah,
aspect
we're
of it.
making we're witnessing a regime that is effectively just like mainstreaming things that you would find on pickup artist forums about 10 years ago, but have increasingly over the course of like the past decade and change just more and more become mainstream conservative politics, mainstream gender politics, mainstream dating politics. A friend of mine the other day just used the word hypergamy in conversation. For listeners who don't know what that is the act of quote unquote marrying up, and she just dropped it in there like it was a normal word for like anyone to know. And quite frankly, the word hypergamy was not in mainstream usage 5 years ago.
No, and that is, if you're at all familiar with this particular history, is very much coming out of like incel culture, red pill culture,
Mhm.
um, which again has its own roots in pickup artist culture. Stuff that was
So
like
now
esoteric and fringe and kind of weird has just absolutely begun to pervade our society.
now Samantha, be careful there, because I feel like you are conflating incel culture with men going their own way and red pill culture and pickup artist culture, which are all very very different. No, I'm kidding. I'm kidding. But that was like an actual thing I saw someone say in like while critiquing the recent Netflix show Adolescence. Oh, you're conflating all these different subcultures because the differences between them are so important.
I mean, there were like, admittedly, they were different subcultures and they were different in various ways, but they were very clearly cross pollinating and clearly an interrelated kind of social movement. So I don't,
Yeah.
anyways.
If people really value the technical differences so much, fine. Let's just call it male grievance politics, because that's
Male
what it
grievance
is.
politics, yeah. I think that's right, and it's been rhetorically, culturally, politically far more successful than we might like. And to try and kind of
Mhm.
understand how that happened and how we got here, and like possibly why we haven't been able to fight it as effectively as we could have, I'd like to take a look through history, as we often do on this podcast, to try and
Mhm.
understand the evolution of feminism and how it got to be where it was 10 years ago. Um, and so to do that, I kind of want to talk about radical feminism, the tradition that you subscribe to, sometimes identified
Mhm.
with second wave feminism from the 60s and 70s. Um, what is radical feminism? I mean, as a radical feminist, what is radical feminism?
Oh boy. All right. So I'm gonna before I start talking about the sort of like history of the feminist movement and things like that, and I will disclaimer, I am not a historian. I may not be a perfect source. I just read a lot and write a lot about this topic. It is my passion. It is my life's work. But at the very same time, I am by no means infallible. I am just, I think, more informed than average. So that's my disclaimer to start with. But before I even start talking about the history, I'm going to have to address the elephant in the room. I'm aware that your average listener, or even just the average person who has even heard the term radical feminist, if they have heard it, associate it now in some way with transphobia, or with this extreme and severe biological essentialism that says women are like this, men are like this, there are two sexes, and they have essential characteristics that differentiate them, and this essential sex difference is the root of misogyny. That is the idea that most people have of radical feminism. A little bit earlier in my writing career, I was very outspoken about the fact that that is a distortion of radical feminism, and not really representative of the actual militant and revolutionary social constructivist insights that the actual rad fems of the second wave were working on. But I have also encountered people who are, some of whom lived through the history, who told me that, both critics and allies have talked to me about this historical moment, and the takeaway that I want to stress and make clear to everyone, is that all of these artificial dividing lines that we make, there was a sharp divide between the social constructivist and the bioessentialist, or there are things called waves, and that there is a sharp line between the second wave of the 70s and 80s and the third wave beginning in the 90s. It's largely made up. It's as socially constructed as the institutions of gender and sex themselves, because we're talking about a discipline. Okay, feminism is a discipline. It's a school of thought first and foremost. It's not just a brand. It's not just a personal identifier. It is an actual discipline that has had various schools of thought that people who disagree have collaborated in and produced differing perspective on. It has lots of different sub schools, and so anything I say over here is going to necessarily be reductive, but mostly I would like to encourage people to think about the fact that, this is a much richer and more complex history than any of us are necessarily familiar with. We're certainly not taught it in schools, so I would encourage people to engage with it more on that level as well.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. I think it's important to understand feminism as an intellectual tradition, an intellectual project, as well as a political movement,
Hmm.
one that stretches back quite a long ways now and is quite rich, but also rich in
Yep.
disagreement and rich in different strains. And so, admittedly, a bit of a social construct in various ways to even talk about radical feminism as a sub school in that.
Hmm.
But give it all those caveats. What was radical
Yeah.
feminism?
So, radical feminism was actually a response to the initial the initial onset of the second wave feminist movement. So we're gonna have to rewind back to the 60s a little bit, right? So the second wave is thought of to have been kicked off by Betty Friedan by her writing The Feminine Mystique, and sort of like kicking off the first rather large scale feminist consciousness raising event, at the very least in the United States and the West, if not the wider world. And Friedan's feminine mystique is very important, but crucially and interestingly, it's not radical feminism. If you had to actually like pin a label or like assign it to a feminist school, apparently it would actually be most accurate to call it liberal feminism. Because what the second sex was fundamentally was, it was a book that was it prided itself as like naming an issue in American society and civil life that had been heretofore unnamed. Okay, so um, I on Blue Sky I have my middle name as epistemic. It's a bit of a fancy $10 word, but like I have been trying my best to just like just meme it into existence, as it were, because all it means is that it's related to the processes of knowledge production of like um, how what we know and how we know them and how our collective and shared body of knowledge is produced. And it's a really important word to me because if you actually look at the oppression of trans people and even the oppression of women, if you actually look at patriarchal and misogynistic history, you will find that all of the issues are deeply related to questions of epistemic injustice, which is like, locking marginalized people out of the processes of knowledge production itself. So you have people who speak about marginalized people, speak to them sometimes, speak for them, of course, but you very rarely hear from marginalized perspectives themselves. And so, what Betty Friedan and Simone de Beauvoir and like these early second wave feminists were doing was that they were pushing back against a centuries and centuries of misogynistic epistemic injustice and epistemicide that women as a whole have suffered throughout history,
Mhm.
because think about it, think of the history of medical misogyny, think of like the way there have been certain psychological, think of the way that there have been actual diagnoses like hysteria, that are simply pathologizing like perfectly normal feelings of like desire or autonomy in women and things like that. That's all epistemic injustice. That is all basically like defining women and womanhood as purely relegated and confined to the domestic sphere. Um, and ultimately, what Betty Friedan's what Betty Friedan's feminine mystique was doing was it was trying to give name to a lot of these issues that everyone was aware of but was scared to talk about. Issues of like the meniality and drudgery of how housewife of the housewife's work, of the mother's work, about the fact that it was difficult for women to actually do all of this labor that was thankless and monotonous and repetitive and boring and uncompensated,
Mhm.
um, and also just touching upon issues of like domestic violence, about how women were expected to put on this front of being able to do it all, so they very rarely were even able to share these travails with each other, and like how they experienced a certain degree of isolation from each other, of loneliness, one might even say. Um,
Yeah, so I think that's very interesting too, because it really prefigures a lot of what radical feminists will wind up doing later in the 60s.
mhm,
And here I'm drawing a lot on Alice Eccles's book, Daring to be Bad, which is a great
mhm,
book. Strongly recommend everybody read it to really understand like the nuts and bolts of the radical feminist movement.
mhm,
And according to Eccles, like many of the what we understand as radical feminism emerges out of the broader new left civil rights movement of the 60s.
mhm,
Many women were involved in these movements, played important roles, important organizing roles. And as time went on, they started to become increasingly unhappy about it, because they were important and they were working hard and they were trying to fight for the liberation of everybody, and it felt like they were still being treated like shit. Stokely
mhm,
Carmichael famously has this. He says, "Of course, there's a place for women in SNCC, that's the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. That position is prone." And here's her saying, uh,
mm,
"Yeah, it was a laugh line, but there was a moment when other female organizers heard it and they were like, 'We need our own movement.'" Right? These
mhm,
guys who are running this, they just see us as sexually available and useful because we clean up after the meeting's over, but they're not letting us lead and they are misogynists and we need our own movement. And one of the things that they do as part of that movement, their most famous organizing tactic is consciousness raising, where you would get together and you would just talk about the kind of
Mhm.
misogyny and sexism that were like the air you breathed. And these groups were electrifying for the women who participated in them to finally like speak and be heard and be seen and to know they were not alone and to realize that actually misogyny, patriarchy, sexism are huge problems and shared problems.
Epistemic justice, baby. And
Yeah, precisely.
here's here's the first big irony. So, given the reputation that radical feminism has today, it is a little bit funny to think of it as this kind of like countercultural, counter-hegemonic movement that is actually incredibly stressing all of these social factors that affect women's lives. Because radical feminism was in part also a critique of the prevailing feminist of the day. Like, if you read Adrienne Rich's Compulsory Heterosexuality, that comes way later, obviously. But if you read Adrienne Rich's Compulsory Heterosexuality, which is sort of considered this landmark, almost foundational piece of lesbian feminism, one of the interesting things about the paper you will find is that a lot of it is dedicated to pushing back against rhetoric that heterosexual feminists of the time, middle class heterosexual feminists of the time, were kind of pushing forward. Because if you sort of look at Freudianism, and if you decide to call it that, just to sort of differentiate it from what we understand as liberal feminism in the modern day, then it was principally concerned with the plight of the middle class white woman in America. There were obvious racial slants in Betty Friedan's organization that people noticed and commented on, and there was a certain fixation on it being a very reformist, respectable woman. There's an autobiography. No, sorry, not autobiography. There's a biography of Betty Friedan that I've looked at that talks a lot about how she really was on this quest for like PR friendly, really normal looking suburban white women who could sort of give a palatable, sort of like very very mainstream face to her feminist movement and her feminist organization. Because she wanted to advocate for women's rights, but she didn't want to be too disruptive. And then completely conversely, radical feminism emerges from this new left tradition, from this disillusion with the new left. Even feminist movements emerging from disillusionment with the left, whether good ones or bad ones, is actually kind of a funny recurrent historical trend. And the radical feminists are talking about change on a much more fundamental level. So radical over here means to the root. Trying to get to the root of patriarchy, or trying to get to the root of like misogyny and male supremacy in our society. And they're making all of these like statements about how misogyny is embedded into our very culture, our very history, all of our institutions, about how if we actually want change, if we want things to improve, it's going to have to change very radically. It's going to require a complete reimagining, not just reformation, not just the reformism that difference feminism was asking for. Emphasizing that, like, oh, men and women are different, sure, but we women deserve to be treated better. Women deserve to be treated equally. Women deserve to be celebrated for their unique strengths. And then radical feminism comes along and says, no, that's bullshit. Okay? Man and woman only has meaning insofar as our culture gives it meaning. And to sort of like and this is a point that's like very difficult for people to sometimes come to terms with if you're not like really familiar with like social constructivist models of like various systems. So I'm gonna just try to put it somewhat crassly, like I did in my book. The desire for autonomy, independence, and full participation in public life is not stored in the balls. Like, yes, there are observable differences between the humans we call men and the humans we call women. However, the simple fact of having a womb, or the simple fact of like being the kind of human who is normally perceived to have a womb, that doesn't mean that that human being is a woman, or wants to be a woman, or like is destined to be a wife, mother, and owned by a man. And the simple anatomical facts of a person's existence should not confine them to one biodestiny or another. And that was it. That was the whip crack. That was the sort of like lightning bolt insight of like radical feminism, which is, and those kinds of like theories coming out of like lesbian feminism and nascent radical feminism roughly around the like late 60s early 70s mark. That was sort of the intellectual peak of the movement,
Yeah, it's
unfortunately.
interesting that you mentioned the peak of the movement because it doesn't last very long,
Hmm.
right? It is a
Nope.
right. It kind of explodes on the scene. It has these radical new theories about, well, there's sex on one side and there's gender on the other, and gender is constructed, and we should totally deconstruct it and reconstruct something new and better, and then it all decoheres, kind of
Hmm.
fades away for a variety of reasons. And I'm curious what
Yeah.
your account of that is. What happened to radical feminism?
Okay. So the radical feminists were living in harmony, and then everything changed when the cult femmes. All right, so there is no cultural feminist out there who I think would actively claim the label cultural feminism. It is a label that has been applied to a sort of other half of the radical feminist movement, or to these like other trends that emerged in the second wave, sort of contemporary to and maybe like slightly after, these main radical feminist innovations of social constructivist theory and lesbian feminism and things like that. So what we call cultural feminism, we one thing I have to emphasize is that like they call themselves radical feminists, and so all of these women, even the social constructivist ones, they viewed the cultural feminists as colleagues. They were moving in the same social and intellectual circles. They probably had brunch and played bocce ball together. Just putting that out there. There is no neat, clean dividing line. It's all messy. It's all history. But insofar as we attempt to understand what ended up happening, um, alongside all of these social constructivist trends that were questioning the naturalization of biology of sex, which was understood to be a tool of patriarchy. Like we can patriarchal ideologues justify the oppression of women by saying it's just natural, it's just biology, it's just evolutionary. It's not really oppression because it's women's role anyway. We want to be nurturers and babysitters and all of that stuff, which is why because it's our natural role that we already want to do. We need to orient the entire structure of society and our legal systems and our political institutions to make sure we don't get funny ideas and contravene our natural role because it's so
Yeah, it's
natural
funny
to
how
us.
that works, that the natural always needs so much social to reinforce it. Um,
Yep.
so one thing I would might tell that story a little bit differently. Um,
Okay.
that that what happens with radical feminism is it breaks away from the new left, from existing social movements. It
Mhm.
wants a woman's politics. It says we need our own political movement as women, not as workers or as leftists or as one of these other identities, but we need our own movement as women to fight against women's
Mhm.
oppression. And this it produces some very interesting radical theories, but it also leads to the question, well, what is a woman's problem? And which
Mhm.
women, right? Are the problems of middle class white women the same as working class
Mhm.
black women or women in the third world or
So
lesbians
this is
or etc.? I just want
so
to,
this is the second irony, right? Oh yeah. So go ahead.
um, and I think what kind of happens here is you wind up with a sort of a fork in the road, where some
Mhm.
people kind of respond to that by going in this cultural feminist direction that you've been talking about, and say, "Oh no, there is a distinctive women's politics," and it's well,
Mhm.
we'll get to what they think the distinctive women's politics is, and the other half kind of goes in a different direction, and that's what we would now call an intersectional direction. Um,
Mhm.
and but first, though, what is we'll come back to intersectionality because that's kind of the one that wins the
Mhm.
argument. But what is cultural feminism?
That's kind of the big one, yeah. So, um, Yeah, this is the second irony. That's what I was trying to say earlier. This is the big second irony thing, because like, so radical feminism has its moment in the sun as this big countercultural movement that is actually critiquing the entrenched institutions and talking about, like, all these biases in the prevailing feminist movement. But then something happens, and what happens is that, two somethings happen. One, um, it encounters its own big irreconcilable schism from within, and two, um, as patriarchy always does, as capitalist institutions always do, there is an attempt at recuperation, and it achieves a certain degree of success. Radical feminism is not immune to institutional recuperation. We all know this all too well, sitting here in 2025. So the big thing, and I actually put this forward. I posit this in my book. The big thing is that, like, radical feminism finds the ultimate validation of all of its theories. Right? If you believe that women are not born but made, if you believe that gender is something that is cultural, that is socially constructed, that is actually applied to bodies and not an inevitable outcome of the bodies themselves. Like, politics do not stem from biology. Politics is applied to biology. If you believe those things, then the existence and the oppression of the transsexual woman validates every single radical feminist theory you subscribe to. Because here are women who do not, or like have some kind of, significant anatomical, biological, whatever distinction, whatever you want to call it, they have some distinction from you, yet you can clearly observe they move through society as women. They face discrimination and violence and violent rhetoric as women. But
But
um but we're icky, so, you know.
yeah,
And that's a joke, but I will say that, like, without talking around it, a lot of cis people have a reflexive disgust reaction to us, to trans women in particular, and frankly to a lot of trans people, trans experiences, trans stories in general, because, this thing that Serrano and I call sexism is really deeply embedded in our societies. This idea that, like, um, sex is immutable and unchangeable, and if you do change your sex, you are doing some kind of, like, horrible abomination against God's plan or nature's plan, or like whichever ontological data you happen to believe in. And even since people who don't quite consciously, know that they hold those beliefs, they still react somewhat, like, with a little bit of cringe, with a little bit of revulsion when they encounter trans people, and it's something we all have to unpack. But yeah, a lot of people, rather than actually viewing the transsexual question as sort of the ultimate vindication of radical feminist politics, fell back on, "You icky tranny male invaders, kill them all."
yeah, and I think that's right, and that sort of leads to this particular branch of radical feminism that we call cultural feminism, going back to what you called difference feminism. Oh, there are differences
Mhm,
between men and women, and they are based in biology, and we just want to
mhm.
celebrate the women's role, and there's all kinds of stuff about
Yep.
that, and you have all this divine feminine stuff that is a big in the time period. Um,
Hmm.
and that's one path that the radical feminists take that has
Hmm.
less of a, well, whatever. I think it has less of a current impact on feminism today. And the other path, the one that is far more influential in
We'll
today's
get back to that.
feminism, we'll get back to that. Oh yes, there is that one thing, the big yes, the elephant in the room here. But we'll get
Mhm,
back to that hopefully. Um, the other branch is the intersectional branch, um, right?
mhm,
And intersectionality is a concept that comes out of the work of Kimberly Crenshaw, um,
mhm,
and I think it purports to resolve some of the tensions that we've talked about that radical feminism ran into. And could you walk us
mhm.
through how that works?
Sure. Um, so intersectionality. This is the big one, right? So after the misandrist lesbian rad femmes mucked everything up and gave feminism a bad name, Kimberly Crenshaw rides in on a horse in 1989 and saves feminism from itself with her groundbreaking legal theory of intersectionality, or so the story goes. Um, in truth, there's a couple different intersectionalities, right? Um, Intersectionality these days is really in the eye of the beholder, and there is the 1989 paper by Crenshaw called "Demarginalizing the Intersection of Race and Sex," um, that was incredibly groundbreaking and influential in academic feminist circles. You know, it has an impact way past legal theory. But in terms of like its impact on what we would understand as like the mainstream feminist movement, it doesn't really proliferate in the wider consciousness until the 2010s. Is the thing. Um, I'm going to talk a little bit about the original paper first. I have an entire podcast episode that's like 1 hour 40 minutes. So I could talk about this. I could literally talk about this all day, but I'll keep it as concise as I can. So intersectionality is big insight. Crenshaw's big insight over here is that she notices some discrepancies in specifically anti-discrimination case law, whereby the treatment of Black women in particular is illustrative of this social principle about how multiply marginalized people don't just like first of all, multiply marginalized people experience multiple stresses on their life. They're subject to injustices of various kinds. They experience a multiplicity of oppressions, but it's not as simple as like racism plus misogyny equals misogynoir. It's reconstitutive. Multiply marginalized people suffer unique harms that is a result of them occupying those multiply marginalized identities in a society that is hostile to all of them. In the specific case of the demarginalizing paper, she notices some case law where the big one is against General Motors. So General Motors has a hiring discrimination suite against it, alleging that they don't hire enough Black women. But according to the case law, you have to either bring a sex discrimination case or a race discrimination case against General Motors. You can't do both. Why? Fuck you. Um, and so the court rules that like, well, you can't bring a sex discrimination suit against General Motors because they hire white women, and you can't bring a race discrimination suit against General Motors because they hire Black men. And then they say something that's very interesting and revealing. The court at this point says, we can't really allow y'all to combine statutory remedies and form a super protected class. Like, imagine if there was a class of people in the United States legal system that had special privileges.
Imagine.
How unprecedented that would be. Yeah. Um, and then there's more. She talks about more case law, and she expands it to not just legal theory, but she's actually talking about how this affects Black women in their day-to-day lives, or even in activist movements, about how women of color in general, to generalize, are expected to often choose between their sex and their race. They're asked to like declare allegiance when in fact the ravages of racism and misogyny impact them equally. And so if you had to sum up intersectionality, it's basically stop making me choose, dumbass.
Yeah, and so I
Because these are
think
both important problems to me.
I'm going to tell you a story about intersectionality, and you can
All right,
agree
hit
with
me.
it or disagree with it or complicate it. But first, let me tell a story.
Mhm.
That on the one hand, there's intersectionality as a theory, as Crenshaw's papers, and when you come to it, it's just
Mhm.
obviously correct, right? What she's
Mhm.
saying about like, yeah, we have to recognize that different axes of marginalization can come together and produce unique results that aren't just additive, and we have to recognize this as a form of
Mhm.
both racial and sexual discrimination. That's all fundamental and correct, and we
Yeah.
all have to account for it. What intersectionality also is, like many great theoretical insights, is fruitful. It forms a kind of a research
Mhm.
program because one thing you can do is go looking for more intersections. You can say, well,
Mhm.
like she has first the intersection of being Black and being a woman, but we can look for other intersections. And I'll tell other stories about how different forms of marginalization interact to produce new and unique forms of oppression. And there's so much stuff you can write about this. And you can do it in a way that shows that you're not falling victim to the problems that the radical feminists had. You're not privileging race over sex or or sex over class, you're incorporating all these different
Mhm.
forms of oppression. And that's, again, it's very important. But what it leads to is something that I've called on occasion the intersectional truce, because what the
Okay.
truth is that we only talk about the intersections and we only talk about the details, and we stop doing too much in the way of big theory about, like, well, what
Mhm.
is patriarchy, what is a racial caste system, what are their origins and their natures, these things that the radical feminists were obsessed with, but that
Mhm.
trying to answer those questions led them into these theoretical and political practical problems that kind of destroyed their movement. So there were reasons people didn't want to do that. They just wanted to focus on the granular details of oppression. And I
Mhm.
think my own view is that this has left us with a void at the heart of feminism, because we just don't have answers to those big questions anymore. To what is patriarchy? What is sexism? What is a racial caste system on a theoretical level?
So I can't speak for her. Please do not come at me. But um, I have a sneaking suspicion. I have an inkling that I think Kimberly Crenshaw might agree with you on that one.
Okay.
So let's talk about the other intersectionality now. Okay, yeah, you're absolutely right. So a lot of people who know the word intersectionality haven't actually read Demarginalizing the Intersection of Race and Sex. A
Nobody
little
reads Davy.
inside base. Yep, a little inside baseball for you. There are academics who have written papers on intersectional feminism who, after the publication of my Substack essay on, I wrote an article about the mainstream conceptions of intersectionality and like where they sort of go wrong. More than one academic friend has told me that, like, yeah, no one actually reads the demarginalizing paper as part of their intersectional feminism courses. So
I
where
just
where where where,
the
where
kind of intellectual tradition I come from. It's just like, how can you not do that? You always have to start with the canonical works. They're canonical for a reason.
J-
But sorry, that's just
Jean
personal.
Baudrillard is Jean Baudrillard is giving us all a massive thumbs up from the grave. I think he's dead. Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, so what is the intersectionality that people understand divorced from the actual thinker or who formulated, or even the thinkers who came after? Like, okay, so you're not engaging with Crenshaw. What about Patricia Hill Collins? What about all of the other Black feminist thinkers who have expanded on it, critiqued it, whether like fairly or not? Because like some critiques of intersectionality are less critiques of Crenshaw's intersectionality and more critiques of interpretations of Crenshaw's intersectionality by people who haven't read Crenshaw's intersectionality. It's a mess. It's lovely. So most people think basically that intersectionality is an excuse to not give a crap about feminism anymore. And that's a strong statement. And that's a bold statement. And I would make it, I would make it based on my own experiences, based on my own, my own testimony and things like that. But I don't have to, because Kimberly Crenshaw wrote a paper in 2010 talking about how fed up she is of this bullshit.
Yeah, I think that's great, and that kind of leads me into the next question I wanted to ask you, which is that if you spend any time online today, it becomes pretty clear that on the left, people's touchstone theory is not feminism. Their touchstone theory is anti-capitalist theory or post-colonial theory. Um,
Mhm.
and I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the relation between feminism and these two other kind of popular intellectual traditions.
Sure. Feminism is bourgeois bullshit. It is a CIA op invented to divide the working classes. There is absolutely no antagonism between members of the same race or members of the same class. That is as monumental or as insurmountable as the antagonism that exists between upper class women and all other women, or white women and all other women. So women, if you say that all women are oppressed by patriarchy or are affected by misogyny, then you're doing essentialism. But you're not doing essentialism if you like lump all non-white people all non-white people together for the sake of your anti-racist project, because yeah, all non-white people have the exact same interest. There's no internal contradictions between us. So yeah, does that answer your question?
Yes, perfectly. Well,
So
yeah, I mean, I think
um,
it's a good caricature of how some people seem to approach these problems. That as post-colonial theory, anti-capitalist theory has kind of gained ascendance, um, you'll find people committed to some very strange ideas about feminism
mhm,
and history, where they'll make claims that, well, where does misogyny come from? Well, it comes from capitalism. Where does misogyny come from? Where does homophobia come from? Colonialism, right? The British brought, in addition to the ships and the guns and the rifles, they brought homophobia with them wherever they went, and it totally wasn't there beforehand.
mhm.
And I know you've written about this, so I'm just kind of like throwing this one softly over the plate for you. What's up with that?
So what's up with that is so I'm gonna do something that I feel like I have earned the privilege to do. I'm gonna talk about Westerners the way Westerners often talk about my people, real quick.
Okay, I will
So
gird my loins and prepare.
yep. So I think that because Christianity has such a deep seated entrenchment in all Western cultural institutions, along with its original sin of like basically anti-Semitism. So even amongst people who don't consider themselves like very Christian or things like that, uh, we in critiques of the New Atheist movement, we saw this concept of cultural Christianity emerge, and I think it really, really manifests over here because one big failing of like Western leftists that I have noticed, and when I say noticed, I mean I've been hit in the face with it over and over again, is the fact that they are simply unable to think in terms of nuance. They must have a fall to point to and a prelapsarian past to yearn for before that fall. So, some people are like, oh, well, the advent of capitalism, that was the fall. And, all pre capitalist relations were utopic and ideal. Or like colonialism, the onset of this global project of Western hegemony, that was the fall. And before then, pre-colonial societies or like pre-colonial non-Western societies, they had utopic gender relations. They had third genders and fourth genders and so many genders as far as the eye can see, and there was no patriarchy, and patriarchy was invented by British guys in red coats circa the 17th century or something to sell more children's toys. And it's just immensely frustrating as someone from one of these cultures.
Yeah, so I mean, you write about this in your book, what it was like growing up in India in what you say is an intensely patriarchal culture. And sure, there are British influences, but you argue that that patriarchy and that misogyny long predates the colonial era.
Yeah, because like the things that our institutions venerate. So okay, so let me put it like this. Okay, the impact that the British Raj had on India, it's difficult to overstate. It did in fact reorient our society from top to bottom. We were subject to constant famine, like extraction of our wealth and our resources, and the subjugation of our people for centuries. It's a lot to reckon with. I have a genetic predisposition to diabetes because of the famines that the British subjected my ancestors to. You can look that up. It's like an epigenetic thing or something. So I lose the word. Sorry, but yeah,
That seems plausible.
yes.
The
So
epigenetic, sorry, that's probably
the
the right word.
yeah, yeah. So colonialism had a massive, like almost an unfathomable impact on my country and culture. At the same time, at the same time, the British Raj did not invent the caste system. And funnily enough, you will actually find some Hindu nationalists in the modern day who claims that they did. Like, oh, we were actually sorting out the caste system just fine. It was this historical relic, and then the British came back and they found it convenient to put it back in. And then all of the upper caste Hindus found it very convenient to go along with it, of course. Yeah, no, yep. Or like, yeah, so like, if you let's ignore gender and queerness for a moment because we know that like a lot of leftists and post-colonial folks don't find that very interesting. but like even in terms of like just I come from a theocratically segregated society. Okay, large swaths of my society and culture are deemed fit for nothing more than menial labor, are deemed untouchable by the upper castes, and like your caste is something that you are born into and that you are dying in, and that you will die in, and it's all justified on spiritual and religious reasons, and it's just like that predates colonialism. And then when you start thinking about gender or queerness, there's a lot of flawed, faulty cultural anthropological work talking about the gender expansiveness of Indian society, or talking about like these expansive notions of queerness and gender in Hinduism, and it leaves out all of the parts of the Hindu text that designate women as inferior, and that mandate a death sentence if a man is to ever sleep with a eunuch. So,
Yeah, so I mean, I find these kinds of pop anthropological claims immensely frustrating. Um,
mhm.
because they just seem like they are, in many cases, recreating noble savage ideas, where it's to say, oh, like you've been
it's
talking about,
it's
there's the
deeply
prelapsarian right, there's the prelapsarian third world, and they had an expand. They didn't have any homophobia. They had all these genders. It was totally tolerant. Women were celebrated. Don't ask what they were celebrated
mhm.
for exactly, but women were celebrated and venerated, and they had goddess worship, and so that clearly means that they were more feminist. And then capitalism and imperialism came, and it brought with it all this stuff that we don't like, and we
and
just need to
and then
return.
the Fire Nation attacked, and then the Fire Nation always attacks and ruins my Orientalist fantasy land that I was hoping to return to, or
Mhm.
draw some quaint colored wisdom from, to through which I can improve and contrast white society in my movie, so that we can have a nice third act climax. Like it's all so blatantly narrativized, and it's all such a refusal to like just engage with the complexity of real life. Like how do you think I feel? Like I don't have anything to return to. I'm intimately familiar with how my culture treats trans women, or trans people in general, queer people like me. There isn't even a word for lesbian in my culture, which is a thing I've harped on about in like various different platforms. But like that is like my example of like epistemic injustice. I had to learn the words to describe what I am from the language of my colonizers. That is the level of epistemic injustice against people like me in India. Okay, I am fully familiar with our history, our culture, how it treats women, how it treats people like me. And then I go to the West and it's more or less the same. It's more of the same. And I'm also a second class citizen over here. So
Yeah.
it's
So
messy. Everywhere is messy, and everywhere has oppressive institutions. And I find that like these invocations of intersectionality, to try and bring it back to stuff we were talking about earlier in the episode, these invocations of intersectionality to focus on a very granular view of oppression, or to just like constantly complicate these things instead of like trying to think of like big picture questions of like oppressive institutions, or like systems of extraction or systems of labor. It all really seems like, well, first and foremost, it's anti-feminist. It's because misogyny is considered the least important. The liberation of women is considered the least essential because our oppression has been so naturalized. But also, it is a refusal to reckon with the complexity of the world, of the things like, those people may not treat women and queers the best, but that doesn't mean we should be fucking bombing them. I
yes,
think that's a simple statement, but that seems
I
to be
think that
really
is a
complicated for a lot of people.
surprisingly, it's a coherent statement that many people seem to struggle with. I think it's more than just complexity. I think it's a matter of kind of, I mean, to put it in a slightly elevated term, it's a matter of intellectual courage. That one of the things I admire
Right.
about the radical feminists, the original radical feminists, is that they were willing to kind of stare directly at the sun, or
Mm-hmm.
to like look into history and be properly horrified by what they saw there, to reckon with with the fact that like the past is not a pretty place, right? You look into human history and you see a lot of oppression, right? And it's not just modern, it's not just capitalist, it's not just the age of European imperialism. You look anywhere and you see a lot of oppression, and it's
Mm-hmm.
disturbing to be human and to look at our past and to think, is this what we are, and to wonder how can we be better than what we have been. And I think people don't like to grapple with that darkness, and so they invent this prelapsarian past that we can get to. I think it leaves them with a kind of an intellectual disability, that it leaves us as progressives or leftists, whatever, liberals, whatever you want to call it, as we endorse these kinds of ahistorical theories, it leaves us with enormous liabilities because we wind up committed to false claims about history, to bullshit,
Hmm.
frankly. And we do have opponents out there, and they can smell the bullshit and they'll attack us on these places where we have made ourselves vulnerable by refusing to reckon with history and with complexity, as
I'm
you say.
so glad you said that. I'm so glad you said that because look, I have not watched all of Matt Walsh's What Is a Woman, but like so Matt Walsh's What Is a Woman, I believe it has a section where it like he talks to a Western queer person about their conceptions of gender and like, or he gets this notion of like, third world societies have this expansive view of gender from somewhere. And then he goes and then he does this like it's one of the most voyeuristic sections in the video in his movie, but like he actually interviews an African tribe and says, hey, so what are your views on gender? And like you don't have to go all the way to interview an African tribe. You could like even interview like a Hindu pundit in India and things like that. Like, why would you make such strong claims that are not empirically provable and that on some level I refuse to believe, honestly, I will say I refuse to believe that like Westerners are on average so racist that you can just make any claims about non-Western societies and they will be uncritically taken up like this. And yet this seems to be the case with not just your average Western queer person, but also with a lot of people in the academy. And I
Yeah,
don't
so
really know
that's
what to
right.
do with them.
This isn't just, internet posters we're talking about here. You've written extensively about various people in the academy who just wind up committed to this stuff that is like unjustifiable, but they need it to be true. They deeply need it to be true.
I have okay. So like the most cited work in the Academy on the Hijra is from 1991, and it has all of this like really Orientalist, like, oh, they occupy such a special place in society, and they are a goddess worshipping religious cult, and yada yada yada, and like I have someone from these community. I've added her on WhatsApp. We like chat about stuff on occasions. I would call us friends. Up to her really. I think she finds me a bit annoying. Recently, she like sent me a photo of herself doing her estrogen shot while Susan Stryker's "My Words to Victor Frankenstein" plays in the background. And as long as we're publishing false crap about like hydras and about third sexes in India and the academy, can I get a grant to talk about the venerated Indian third sex that does these rituals with like trans lesbian trans feminist history and estrogen shots? I can produce a much more entertaining book than the cultural anthropologists of the 90s did. Let's just say.
I would be tempted to agree with that. So I don't. In this podcast, I try not just to be critical, but also to look to the future a little bit, and
Mhm.
to ask, if the feminism that we have today is in crisis, if we are facing an immense misogynist backlash, but also a kind of an internal intellectual crisis in our movement in understanding
Mhm.
what even is feminism. What do you think can be done to revitalize feminism? Right? Swing for the fences here. Don't be shy.
Okay. We've got to be more normal about trannies.
Okay.
So I'm not gonna yeah so this is I'm not gonna pretend that this isn't a particularly self-serving theory in some way. It is. Fine, you got me. I believe that the trans woman is a feminist subject worth taking seriously. But this is not just me saying it. Bathrooms, prisons, sports. You look at reactionary messaging today, and gender is absolutely core to it, and transgenderism is even more core to it. The reactionaries of today have mainstreamed regressive gender politics off of a two-pronged approach. One, executing a similar move, the recuperation of a feminist currents that have noticed insufficiencies and inadequacies in the left's response to all these gender crises of the modern day. So, if you're unsatisfied with the utter nonsense and the counterfactuality of mainstream feminism, all this Orientalism and all this like rather surface level reductive engagement with trans politics, why not try a little bit of reactionary feminism, a little bit of gender critical feminism that aligns completely with abortionists and with people who believe that your biology is your destiny and you are destined to be a mother who cannot exercise autonomy over her own body, and if they have their way, who cannot even leave a divorce. But the gender critical feminists, they have a lot of the aesthetics of speaking truth to power. They're rude and they're mean and they're cruel and they rail against the idea that you should be nice and kind because that's your female socialization. Transcend your female socialization and be mean to these trans people.
Yeah,
And
I mean,
and that's appealing in one way. Um, and then the other prong is just, world is hard, return to trad wife. And
yeah,
we're not going to be able to actually adequately meet that challenge. We're not going to be able to address this crisis unless we're actually able to like look at this question. We're able to stare it dead in the face, and we're able to just let go of our collective attachment to sex. You said something earlier about how like leftists are a little bit scared, like or like progressives. It's a little bit terrifying to look at everywhere, to look at history, to look at different countries and to see that they have all instituted some kind of class system, some kind of inequality. We've always like founded societies on oppressive logics, and then asking yourself, is this what we are destined to be? And my answer to that is hell to hell no. And you know taking what seems like immutable destiny and then forging it in your own image is kind of our whole thing.
ever so slightly. Yeah, I mean, I think you're right to see gender politics as central to the modern reactionary project. And I think the
Mhm.
kinds of currently popular progressive theories have like demonstrated themselves by now to be pretty clearly inadequate to the task, right? Like the kind of like, well, everything is capitalism theory that you see in like the class reductionist style of politics that
Mhm.
Bernie and others have put forward hasn't done what it promised in terms of like converting the unconverted and riding to an immense electoral victory. And I think that's because it fails to reckon with what is really going on the right. That the right is animated by a biopolitical vision of societies not as communities of persons with shared values or shared interests, but as biological communities that are set against other biological communities and locked in a zero sum circle for survival. Um, and that kind of
It was race
biological
realism before
logic.
it was sex realism.
No, I think that's, and I think once you see things this way, it can help answer some of the questions that ripped apart the first wave of radical feminism, right? This, that you could see how, like you say, a racial realism and a biological realism fit together very cleanly in this biopolitical view. And
Hmm.
but recognizing this means recognizing the centrality of feminism to the project of defeating reaction, and that we can't pick up the tools of biopolitics and expect that to lead us away from reaction. That is actually like the core of reactionary theory. And as we indulge in that stuff, we only feed them.
Yeah, look, the central fantasy of the leftist, and I know because I am one, and this is my central fantasy as well. It's my biggest kink, it's my deepest, darkest secret. The thing we get off on the most is the idea that we can just calmly explain how stuff works to a reactionary, and then they will just, like that, be converted. Unfortunately, the immortal science of Marxism, Leninism, Maoism, Kropotkinism, whatever, I don't know how many
Whatever,
names they've
whatever
added
we're
to it
on,
by now.
whatever
Uh,
prophet we're on today.
yeah, the immortal science is not all persuasive, and even if it were all persuasive, there are people who understand class antagonisms who are still right wingers, and that is partly because you don't want to do the Homo economicus thing. We are not a purely rational species or anything like that. But like, even if we were purely rational, what we're encountering is a refusal to admit that like being invested in male grievance politics is rational, or at least rational enough. They believe it's a rational thing to do for a large swath of people. And being invested in these race realist politics twigs as rational for a lot of different people, because they have a particular view of society that isn't entirely compatible with yours, and you have to rise to that instead of hoping against hope that constantly evangelizing, that constantly proselytizing, that constantly thumping your copy of what is to be done is going to meaningfully reach people who engage with politics on a much more visceral level. We need feminism, not just because gender is core to the modern reactionary project, because it is core to the way they want to organize society. If you really think about it, gender is a social technology that basically like it creates imagined communities in a way that like you go all the way back to like Nazi Germany, and the half the point of like all of this nationalist propaganda of creating a national identity was to like unite people who have antagonisms, class antagonisms, gender antagonisms, into a single community that can be dedicated to the nationalist project. So
And they were
in
quite
a very
explicit about that. Right?
yeah,
This isn't
exactly.
some deep reading.
They
They
said
would
it out
just
loud.
tell you, right, that like the goal was to
Yeah,
overcome class antagonism.
fucking
Um,
like people like Hanania say it out loud. These like conservative propagandists have always been very proud of just like putting all of their cards on the table and seeing this is what I'm going to do, and then liberal centrists are very happy to go, political genius. But yeah, in a similar way, if I want to speak about this in leftist terms, you have to reckon with the fact that our societies come pre-embedded with a series of false consciousnesses that you have to help people rise above and address. Like, okay, you believe, okay, or like even or like I believe this too. We believe that like it is more beneficial for people to engage with politics from the perspective of class rather than gender, rather than fall into the rabbit hole of grievous politics, to actually advocate for things like stronger unions and better wages, rather than like I want I want my state mandated girlfriend, and I want her to make me chicken nuggies while I hang out in the gamer basement. We think that is a rational prioritization of events, but not everyone's going to agree with us, and a significant number of men and a significant number of cis women have they have a more visceral attachment to these grievance politics than they do to your rational leftism. And if you want to do rational leftism, and I really really do, you actually have to meet people, you have to understand the present moment, and you actually have to meet people where they are, and you have to accept that they care about what they care about, and that means that you're going to have to care about it too, and you're going to have to do something about it. You're going to have to do something about the work priorities, rather than simply saying, oh, it's not in your interest to outlaw abortion and no fault divorce and like guarantee that you can entrap a young woman. I mean,
yeah, so I am not a radical leftist, but I agree with a lot of what you're saying here, that we have to, whatever ideals we're fighting for, a freer, more equal world for everybody, we have to reckon with this kind of biopolitical reaction as an active force,
mhm.
right? Not just as an illusion that will disappear with the coming of the sun or the right leftist or liberal or whatever it is tract, but an active cultural force that is clearly very powerful. And until we
It's
recognize
not
that,
just a distraction.
it's
It's
not
not
just
just a
a distraction.
distraction.
But we actually need to attack this head on instead of pretending that it doesn't exist. Um, so, yeah, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. This has been a fascinating conversation. Any last words to
Yeah.
close out?
Well, thank you for having me to scream from my soapbox yet again. It is what I do best. No, yeah, no, just thank you for having me. And yeah, this has been a really great and productive conversation, I think.
Okay, thank you so much. And thank you all for listening, and I will see you again next week.